I wanted to quickly discuss an article that came out yesterday that is being pushed around on media and stuff, and a lot of vegans are saying, oh, is this a ridiculous study? It's not a ridiculous study, legitimate study. The study is the Vegetarian and Vegan Diets and Risk of Total and Site-Specific Fractures, done by the EPIC Oxford database by some really top researchers in the field of nutritional science. This is not a biased study. This is not supported by meat and dairy, although you'll see a lot of carnivore sites running with this right now. Funny, they love to run with an article when it's against veganism, but if I show them an EPIC data study that shows, for instance, that vegans have less heart disease or that they have less of certain cancers, far less diverticulitis and diverticular related illnesses, etc., then epidemiology is terrible, the studies are terrible, but now that it works in their benefit, oh my God, this is great. But it is not a bad study. Now you got to understand, they use the EPIC Oxford database. Now this database includes 60,000 people, roughly 60,000 people that were accrued in the 90s and have been followed for many years since. They used food frequency questionnaires. They've questioned these people at 5-year intervals. Of note, this study was an intent to treat. In other words, they've got a person, they know what they ate 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 years ago. They don't know what they're eating right now. So we don't know if their diet has changed over time. And that's obviously a possibility. But still, they do a pretty good job, as good a job as you're going to get in an epidemiologic study to study these things. And in the study, they found that vegans had a higher risk of hip fractures and fractures in general. Vegetarians and fish eaters also had a higher risk than meat eaters. Now, this is an interesting topic when we get to fractures, bone mineral density, because there are papers on both sides of this issue. There are papers that show that the more meat you eat, the more fractures you get. There are papers that show that the more protein you eat, the less fractures you get, though there was a huge meta-analysis and systematic review that was done recently that showed that protein didn't seem to make a huge difference in bone status and the risk of bone fractures. So this is a very complex topic. There's many things to factor in. There's many different reasons that you would get bone fractures, and so that's really important. But I do think this article should draw vegans' attention, and it should make us think about things. And let me go through the article a little bit better. They're using this database. Now, again, this database started accruing in the 90s. That was people that the vegans that they're looking at now were vegan before veganism was cool. These are not the vegan influencers you see with six-pack abs and athletes, all right? They were doing veganism before there were a lot of vegan supplements. They were before we even knew there were supplements. We actually know what these people were eating because they've been studied before. Here's the EPIC Oxford lifestyle characteristics and nutrient intakes of these patients. And we know that these EPIC Oxford people the vegans only get about 20 grams of fiber, 20 to 22. Which is higher than the meat eaters, but not a lot higher. They get about 19. And we also know that they get lower protein intake than the meat eaters. They do eat soy, but they don't tend to get a lot of soy. That's important because when you look at the Adventist Health Study, they actually looked at this very carefully, and they did not see an increased risk of fractures when people were eating and drinking soy. They felt like soy was a good alternative to milk. So if you're not doing milk and you're taking in soy, in the EPIC studies, they did look at soy, and while there was more soy intake in the vegan group, it's less than in the Adventist Health group. And they have found before that there's a much less intake of calcium in the EPIC group. So typically vegans, we eat a lot of dark green vegetables, kale, which is big now, but wasn't back in the 90s. And we have found that that allows us to get more than adequate calcium. In the prior EPIC study done on fractures, they found that if you got over 500 milligrams of calcium, there was no increased risk of fractures. And we know that most of the EPIC people are really not eating as healthy a diet as we recommend. We know that they're fairly low on vitamin D too. The current study does not differentiate vitamin D intake, and we know that vitamin D is very important in calcium absorption. So there's many different factors in here that we have to look at, but let's look at the study. So they looked at different groups, meat eaters, fish eaters, vegetarians, and vegans. Again, this is an old database, but then they looked at hospital records to see if there was fractures, and they looked at those results and found a considerable increased risk in vegans. Now, at first, they did not do controls for weight. So they looked at body mass index as a whole and did not compare. In other words, they did not compare a healthy, skinny meat eater to an overweight vegan. The reason they didn't do that is there aren't a lot of overweight vegans. In fact, when they started trying to control for weight, it was really difficult because there weren't that many patients to do a match between the meat eaters and the plant-based eaters, because the plant-based eaters just weigh less. Now, understand this. The more you weigh, the more dense your bones are, because your body has to support that weight. So just by being overweight, you actually build stronger bones. And by being overweight, you actually cushion your bones. This is actually true. So if you fall, you're less likely to break a bone. And so there's been studies showing before that higher BMI in and of itself leads to less fractures. And so then meat eaters weighing more should have less fractures to begin with. But when they controlled for weight, the vegans still had a higher fracture rate. And then when they controlled for protein intake too, the vegans still had a higher fracture rate. And so that's interesting. Why, after all of those controls, do vegans still have an issue? Again, there's multiple problems. These aren't healthy eating vegans in general. I don't know anything about their supplementation. They didn't look at vitamin D. They did control for calcium intake, but they didn't tell us about vitamin D. So I don't know vitamin D and how that factors into this. But let's say we know in general that in England there's a vitamin D problem. We know from the study before that meat eaters tend to get more vitamin D and the pescatarians, because they are getting fish that does have higher vitamin D. But we could say that the meat eaters are getting more vitamin D and therefore getting more calcium absorption. And so vitamin D may be a big factor that's missing in this study. There's another factor, though, that I want vegans to think about, and that is vitamin K, specifically K2. So we know that plant-based eaters actually do fairly well with vitamin K, and we know that vitamin K is important for bone health because dark green leafy vegetables have vitamin K, but they lack vitamin K2. And that's important. There's actually been studies on vitamin K2, and we are starting to notice that vitamin K2 is an important factor in actually utilizing the calcium that you absorb and putting it into bones. Vegans don't get much vitamin K2 at all. It's pretty much found in cheese, in eggs. You're going to find it in any fermented food. So there's going to be some in sauerkraut. If you're doing a lot of sauerkraut, that's good. Natto, which is a fermented food, it's a typical Japanese food. It is disgusting to me. It may have K2. I don't want any part of it. But K2 may be the factor, because what these investigators are saying is we've controlled for weight, we've controlled for protein, we've controlled for calcium. Why are we still seeing, if we take a meat eater, but they are the same weight and they're eating the same calcium and they're eating the same protein as a plant-based eater, why does the plant-based eater still have a higher risk of fracture? And the answer there may be the K2. Now, typical plant-based vitamins for vegans are supplemented with K2. We don't have any information on whether this EPIC data group is doing any K2 supplementation, just like we don't know about the vitamin D supplementation. In previous studies, they have looked at vitamin D intake. I don't know if they were looking at supplements with that vitamin D intake, but it was much lower in the vegans than it was in the meat eaters. So it could be vitamin 2, it could be K2. It really is hard to say. But again, let me emphasize this extremely strongly. We're not vegan for health. when I am instructing my patients, I don't tell them to go vegan. I tell them to eat a predominantly plant-based diet. I tell them they could have 4 to 6 eggs a week. I tell them that fish 3 times a week is healthy. I tell them that game food is going to be better than the CAFO-raised meat. So when you're doing veganism, it's not like you're doing it for health. It tends to be extremely healthy, but you have to take studies like this into account. And if there are deficits in a vegan diet, you do have to supplement. So for instance, you got to take B12. You should take an omega-3 and you should take a multivitamin. I think that includes K2 based on my review of the literature. So I think this study is important. I do think it does show a potential problem with an unsupplemented vegan diet. But again, there's a lot of problems with the study. We don't know if these people were still vegan. We don't know their vitamin D. We don't know their K2. And so there are some probably inaccuracies. In general, the epic vegans have done a lot worse than vegans in other studies, such as the Adventist Health. So you have to take that all with a grain of salt. The study is in no way a knife through the heart, but at the same time, it is something that you need to pay attention to.